Hello, guys. Welcome back to the Eat Like Ruby podcast. I'm here today, solo episoding, and I am actually just vibing today. I'm excited to be here. It is today. I'm recording on the 26th of July. I was just checking my date. So this episode, I think, is coming out around mid-August. We're a little bit ahead just because we have lots happening, like always. And we've just got like a few different little things happening with the podcast over the next few weeks. So watch this space. But I am just getting ahead. I'm getting organized. And like I said, I'm just vibing today because it's a Friday. It's sunny. Life is good. And I just feel like, I don't know if this is just me or other people can relate, but next week is obviously the last week of July. I just feel like when you get to August, like the year just gets better and better. I feel like if you just go August, September, October, it's just getting like warmer by the week, sunnier by the week, brighter, early mornings, all the things. We obviously have the final round of the fat loss phase starting early September. So I feel like that's always such a positive, exciting round. Not that the other rounds aren't, but with our winter rounds, like massive shout out to the winter girls that did the April and July rounds. July round is running right now, but there's always that element of like early mornings, walking in the dark, getting steps, going to gym when it's freezing. All of that is just like another little obstacle, and it's just a bit of a, I don't want to say a downer, but it's just kind of like hanging over you when you're trying to get through your fat loss phase and you've got all that happening. I feel like as we start to go through August and September, and then obviously we rip into that September round, like I said, it's just getting warm, sunny, bright, early mornings. We can walk, we can gym, all the things. And I just feel like everyone's always like positive and pumped and just getting after it. Personally, I am the same. I feel like with my fat loss phase, I am about a month in right now. And I feel like I've honestly just been like, get through July. Just get through July, Rubes, because it's the start of the fat loss phase. I went from super high calories to low calories, knuckled down. I'm doing my early morning steps. I honestly look like a bit of a homeless man when I'm doing my early morning steps, because I am just one of those people that wears like 4 hoodies, rugged up as, hands in my pockets, hoodie on, just walking around the canal near my house. If anyone sees me, they'll be like, that is not Eat Like Ruby. That is a homeless man. But I am just in a very much like get it done energy. And I feel like that's just the vibe of July, because it's just cold and it's dark and it's shitty. And I just keep on thinking like, if I can get through July, it's just onwards and upwards from August. So now with this episode actually coming out in August, I feel like we should all just be vibing and moving forward and loving life, which I am. But what I am here to do today is a fat loss Q&A episode. So I put the Q&A box up on Instagram like I always do, but I said like specifically fat loss questions, because obviously, like I said, we're coming into our final fat loss phase for the year. Say final fat loss phase 10 times. But it's obviously just like a time where we're really talking about that in Eat Like Ruby, but it's also just a time where I really talk about it because, like I said in recent episodes, I think sometimes people leave that goal a little bit too late in the year, and then they're sort of scramming and it's a bit frantic to get it done. So I like to really go hard on the fat loss chat throughout July and August, so people can set that up throughout like August, September, and actually have a really successful fat loss phase and make the most of it before it's too late in the year to do so. So that's why I thought fat loss Q&A would be great today. Like I said, we have something a little bit cool and different. We've never done this before happening next week on the podcast. So stay tuned. Make sure you're like subscribed, notifications on, whatever it is that you got to do, because it's a little bit different. You might see some different things coming on different days. I'm not going to say too much, but just to make sure you are tuned into the Eat Like Ruby podcast. And especially if you have a fat loss goal, if you've got fat loss questions, if you've got confusion about fat loss, or if you're just keen and getting after fat loss either now or in the coming weeks and months, you definitely want to stay tuned to this podcast over the next 2 weeks. That's all I'm going to say. But I'm going to get into the Q&A right now. Like always, guys, when we do Q&A, we just get flooded with questions, which is cool. It's awesome. But obviously, like 1 hour pod, give or take, I can't answer all of them. So I like to go through and just find things that obviously would have like a good convo, a bit of education, a bit of good content with it. If there was like common themes, like things that came through several times, if there was anything that we haven't really touched on before, anything that I think would be beneficial to the masses, like a lot of people would benefit from hearing, I try and kind of skim through and pick those ones. So that's what I've done today. Like I said, when we do Q&A box, we get flooded. When we do fat loss Q&A box, if you put fat loss at the start of anything, you get flooded. We got so many questions. So I think I've picked a few juicy ones that a lot of people would benefit from. And we're just going to get into it today. And then, like I said, if you have further fat loss questions, stay tuned to the podcast next week. So the first question, and I've kind of got this here twice. This came through in a few ways, but I pulled two specific questions because they're kind of like asking the same thing. So one of them said, if you have a lot of fat to lose, how do you know when to stop and go to maintenance? And then someone else said, how often should you do a fat loss phase if you still haven't reached your body composition goal? So I've actually kind of answered this in last week's episode, but when this Q&A box went up and this question came through, that episode hadn't come out yet. So if you ask these questions, or if you've got this type of a question, definitely go back and have a listen to last week's episode if you haven't, because I really broke down what I would advise people to do depending on if they have like a big weight loss goal, small weight loss goal, and how I would be looking at your nutrition over the next like 6 to 12 months, depending on goals, plans, phases, lifestyle, all of the things that you would want to consider when actually setting up your nutrition plans. So I feel like these questions relate so much to that. So I will summarize it again today, but definitely go back and listen to last week if you haven't. So basically just asking, if you have a lot of fat to lose, how do you know when to go to maintenance? How often should you do a fat loss phase if you still haven't reached your goal? So what I would say here is, if you're in a position, like if we look at that first one, if you have a lot of fat to lose, how do you know when to stop and go to maintenance? What I advise here in short is, if you have excess fat and or weight to lose to reach, like you need to lose that to reach a healthy weight range, I would really look at spending any time you can in a moderate fat loss phase. So what I mean by that is, if you look at your schedule and there's something happening with external factors or lifestyle, or like diet fatigue kicks in and we need diet breaks, etc., you can go to maintenance anytime you want. If you feel like it's not an optimal time for you to be in a deficit and pursuing fat loss, you can go to maintenance at any time. But I would be looking at your schedule, lifestyle, all those things, and just working out when you would need to be at maintenance for any of those reasons. And then anytime you don't have to be, I wouldn't be. So I would be in the deficit. And like I said, I'd be in a moderate deficit, because if we think about a person in this position, I said on last week's episode, if you're in the position of trying to lose like 15, 20, if not more kilos, you want to be able to settle into that in quite a moderate, sustainable, enjoyable way. That's not going to be a really short, sharp, aggressive fat loss phase. That's going to be pretty much your lifestyle for a while, because you're going to sit there and gradually get that weight off, and you want to be able to do that in a way that actually works with your lifestyle and it's enjoyable, it's sustainable, all those things. So what I'm getting at there is, you really want to look at having that in place anytime you can. And then, like I said, if you look at different times in your schedule or your lifestyle and you think like, oh, I've got a holiday here, or I've got a really busy week of exams or moving house or anything like that, where you think it's going to be quite hard and shit for me to stick to a low calorie diet, I would go to maintenance at those times. And then any time that that's not happening, if you're just looking at a usual standard week in your life, I would be asking, can I implement a moderate deficit this week? Yes, I can. Awesome. I'd be doing so. And then the only other thing I said there was being aware of like diet fatigue, and or just like hitting that point where you're like, I need a break from the deficit, maybe physically, hunger, cravings, all of that, maybe just mentally and emotionally. Low calories can take a bit of a toll after a while. So having that up your sleeve as well, and just knowing that if you hit a point where the deficit is becoming quite shitty and quite hard to stick to, you can just go to maintenance for a week or two, whatever you want. But then again, really just thinking anytime that you think you can have a successful deficit in place, I would be doing so. Because really we want that to be our number one priority and our number one goal until we actually reach the healthy weight range. So our health is in a good position. So we're feeling quite good. And then we can look from there like, cool, have I reached my goal? Do I just hang here forever? Do I want to push it a bit further and get like shredded? Do I want to go into like a performance phase, muscle gain phase? You can do any of these things, but really the number one priority is getting to good health and a position where you feel good before we look at anything else. Okay, somebody else asked how to. I haven't actually copied the question here. I've just written night shift. So, but I remember this person asked how to have a successful deficit in place when you do night shift. So this is really common, and I think I've actually answered this literally like over a year ago. So if you're an OG listener or you listen to episodes on repeat, you might think that this is a little bit familiar, but this is something that comes up all the time, especially in things like the fat loss phase or Eat Like Ruby programs, either just doing like night shift or random shifts, like a bit of a random roster. The reason I think this becomes a bit tricky for people is because you don't just tend to have like a typical eating window that's the same every day. If you think about a person who doesn't do night shift, most people probably eat between like 6 or 7 a.m., give or take, and then stop eating around like 7 p.m., right? If someone's doing night shift, they're like could be eating all night, sleeping all day, like it's really different. And then the next day might look really different, or the next week might look really different. So it can be really hard to just get routine and structure in place in that way. The first thing I'm going to say here is, and this is not to the person who actually asked this question, because I know this person, she's been in Eat Like Ruby, she's a queen. So this is not to you, but to anyone in the position of doing night shift and any sort of similar position. You'll see what I mean when I get into it. The first thing that we want to look at here is the mindset and the belief, and really catching with yourself if you're sort of running a story of like, I can't achieve my goal because I do night shift. And the reason I say this is because if we really think about it, if you actually do night shift and that is part of your lifestyle, part of your job, just actually a factual thing about your life, that is what it is, and it's not going to change. So we don't want to get in a position where we're sitting there going, I can't achieve my goal because of this thing. Because for as long as that thing is there, you're not going to achieve your goal. And if you're not planning on changing jobs in the next few weeks or months, then that's going to be a massive cock block on you actually achieving your goal. So really, really catch that. I think it's so common. And like I said, this can happen in so many things outside of night shift. People can do it with like study or just a busy job. My boss makes me stay late, my husband, my kids, anything at all. If you've got something in your life that's actually just a fact and part of your life, really be careful about spending time in the energy of like, I wish this thing wasn't happening. It's so hard to work around this thing. I'm not going to achieve my goal for as long as this thing is here, because that thing is going to be there for a long time. And regardless of how much we whinge about it, how much we wish it was different, who we whinge to, what we say, you could whinge to God himself. It is what it is. So you really, really want to catch that and think, okay, am I going to keep saying, like running this story that I can't achieve it because of this thing? Or do I actually turn that around, flip the wording and say, how do I achieve my goal while this thing is at play? How do I achieve my goal while I do night shift? How do I achieve my goal while I'm studying, etc.? Because like I said, if that thing's not going anywhere, we don't want it to be a cock block on our progress. Otherwise, we're never going to make that progress. So really important thing to think about first. But if we have worked through that and we're like, nope, I'm open to progressing, working with this, etc., that is awesome. You are my type of person. So what I would advise in this position of the night shift is looking at your intake across the whole week, not just day to day. And what I mean by this is, let's say, I'll use myself as an example. Let's say my deficit is 1,600 calories, which it is. If we look at 1,600 calories a day across a whole week, I'm eating 11,200 calories a week. So what I would look at here is eating that across my week, however suited me, within reason. And I'll come back to that. But if you've got a time where you're like awake all day and all night, like you've got this massive shift, or you do shit all day and then you go to work all night and you're just literally awake and eating for a really long time, but then the next day you find yourself pretty much asleep for most of the day. If we think about being on 1,600 calories, you might have like 2,000 of those in that one feeding window of the day into the night shift. But then the next day you might eat like 400 less because you're sleeping all day. And that's just one little example of it. And a cool thing to note here, guys, is if you use MyFitnessPal to track your food, you can look at your weekly like you can look at like a weekly graph and like the weekly averages and everything in there. So this is a really cool way to do it, because if we think again about being on 1600 calories, you might have some days that are like 14 or 15, some that are like 18, 19, and you're just making that work throughout the week. And then you step back and look at the week as a whole and you look at the weekly average and it's really close to where you want to be. So this is a really cool way to do things. And you can do it in a way of like tracking more calories on one day and then tracking less on the other. Or you can even do it like, let's say you are on 1600 calories, and let's say you're on 1600 calories and you're eating and awake all day Tuesday, and then you go into a night shift Tuesday and you get home at like 7 a.m. Wednesday, and then you go to bed and you're asleep for most of the day Wednesday. You can track your 1600 into Tuesday, start tracking into Wednesday, but know that some of those Wednesday foods you might literally be eating at 1 or 2 a.m. Maybe you eat another one of those Wednesday meals at like 6:30 a.m. when you get home, but then you go to bed for 8 hours and then you get up and have like, quote, dinner, which might feel like breakfast. And then again, you sort of look at that day, and even though you had some of those things at 1 a.m. and then other things at 6 p.m. or whatever, you're still on track with your overall intake. So I would be thinking about the overall intake across the days and the week as a whole, not just hitting a certain calorie target every day individually, because you want to be able to work with it a little bit instead of just being like, oh, I have to eat this amount. If you're asleep all day and you just don't feel like eating that, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But then on the flip side, you're awake for like a 24-hour window the next day and you're like, fuck, I need more food. You want to be able to pivot and work with that a little bit. So I would really step back and look at the week as a whole and nail the overall intake like that. And then people can start asking about things like protein and fiber and hitting minimum requirements and everything. Honestly, my advice here is don't overthink it. Look at each meal and ask, am I getting a decent serve of protein with this meal? Look at each day. Look at each, like every second meal. We don't have to have a wicked amount of protein in every single meal, but if you're looking at most meals and being like, yep, I'm getting some protein. If you're looking at most meals and seeing that you're clearly getting regular veggies in, regular fruit, therefore regular fiber, don't overthink the numbers down to the specific grams and the days and the timings and everything. Really just step back and say, am I eating good quality foods and ticking the boxes most of the time? And if you're doing that alongside a solid overall intake for the week, that's perfect. Okay, somebody asked, if I haven't hit my protein for the day, but then doing so will take me over my calories, should I aim for the protein and go over the calories, or should I miss the mark on the protein but then stay within my calorie range? This is actually quite a common question. Like, I feel like I get this often. And there's two things that come to mind here. I'm going to answer the question first. So if we look at this, if we really think about fat loss, and I'm going to speak to this in terms of fat loss because it was a fat loss Q&A. If the goal is fat loss, calories are the number one deciding factor. Like, the overall calorie intake is either going to leave us in a deficit. If it gets a bit higher, it's going to pull us to maintenance. If it gets high enough, it's going to pull us into a surplus. So our number one factor has to be our overall calorie intake, being in a deficit each day, over time, consistently, etc., to move towards a fat loss goal and make fat loss progress. So that's the number one thing we want to have in place. Protein is really, really going to assist that. So if we were to have, like, on a really consistent basis, if we were to nail our calories but really, really miss the mark with protein compared to someone nailing calories and really hitting the mark and getting sufficient protein, we're actually going to have a different outcome with body composition and with fat loss. And the reason for that, I'm not going to get too in depth today, but protein has what we call the highest thermic effect of feeding of all macronutrients. And basically what that means is the work that the body has to do to consume, digest, and absorb protein is more work than when we eat any other nutrients. And so when I say like the body has to work hard to do that with protein, the body works hard and therefore burns calories. So in really simple terms, when we consume protein, our body actually burns more calories working through that protein, digesting, absorbing everything I just said before, compared to other nutrients. So if we think about a day of, let's say, a 1600 calorie day with no protein versus a 1600 calorie day with 130 grams of protein, we're going to actually burn more calories throughout the day because the body's working to get through that protein. So if we think about calories in versus calories out, in both scenarios, 1600 has come in, but in the scenario with the high protein intake as part of that, more calories are going to go out. Obviously, we burn calories through like training, steps, movement, metabolism, all of that. But another way that we burn calories is through TEF, which is called like thermic effective feeding, what I said before. And the way that we can increase thermic effective feeding is by consuming more protein. So I hope that made sense. If you're in Eat Like Ruby, I explain that a little bit more at times, but really keep that in mind. Calories are the number one factor, calories in versus calories out. But if protein is coming in with that, the calories out is going to actually be higher. Therefore, the deficit's going to be more. Therefore, fat loss is going to be more effective. So I would keep this in mind and know that technically when answering this question, calories are number one, but we really don't want to miss the mark with protein. And that kind of brings me to the second thing I was going to say is when this happens, to me, it just suggests that we're not planning in advance. Because if we think about the question, if I haven't hit protein, but doing so will take me over my calories for the day, do I miss the mark on the protein to stay within the calories, or do I get the protein in and go over the calories? If we're planning in advance, we can avoid this happening. And I've spoken about that before, and I speak about this in the fat loss phase hugely. If we are not planning in advance with our nutrition and we have a really clear, strict, definite goal that we'd like to achieve, we're essentially hoping we achieve it. If you get to the end of the day and you log your food back, you're essentially just hoping that it all adds up in your favor and you hit your targets and everything is on point. If we think about having a target, the point of having a target is to work towards it. If we think about logging food after we've eaten it, we're really just keeping a food diary. We're not working towards a target. Like I said, you're hoping that you hit it. And if you haven't, and therefore you end up in a situation like this, because if you get to the end of the day and you log all your food back and then you go, yeah, okay, fuck, I've hit my calories, but I haven't hit my protein. What do I do about it? You're then in this position where you're asking these questions. One thing is going to suffer in order for the other one to get done or get ticked off. If we had planned in advance, we could avoid that happening. So this is a massive piece of advice that I give to people. If we're in a position of wanting to achieve fat loss or any sort of clear, strict goal, this is the very first thing that we look at. If somebody said to me like, Rubes, why am I not progressing towards my goal? Straight away, I'd say, are you planning in advance? If they say no, I'd be like, I'm not looking at anything else. I'm not talking to you about anything else because that has to get done first. There is no point looking at intake, stats, progress, data, numbers, all the things, because we're not working towards them. We're just like I said, keeping a food diary and hoping we hit them. So a little bit off topic to the question, but so important to catch that first. And if you're in this situation, as like a one-off because shit happened and I had to pivot on my plan and now I'm sitting in this position where I've hit my calories but I haven't hit protein, if that is literally a one-off, don't even think about it. I would just stop for the day. I was a little bit fucking short on protein today. Shit happens. Life goes on. Right now, I'm going to plan in advance for tomorrow to make sure it doesn't happen again. You're never going to look back and go, oh, there was that one day at the start of July that I didn't hit protein. That was where all my results came undone. Like, it's never going to be the one day, the one target, the one meal. But if this is happening to you 3 days a week, then obviously that's going to add up in a way where it's like, okay, well, if we then step back and look over a month of doing it 15 times, obviously then that's going to add up a lot differently to doing it one time. So that's where I'd really catch it and say, if it's a one-off, don't overthink it. If it's happening all the time, look at why it's happening all the time. Start planning in advance, getting days in line and getting days in place where this isn't happening. Next question. Okay, somebody said, best way to factor in a pre-workout meal when in a deficit, also best low-calorie options. So usually I say great question. I don't love this question. It's not terrible, but I am going to answer it. But if we think about this, best way to factor in pre-workout meal in a deficit. So I've kind of spoke about this in the episodes a few weeks ago about setting up my own fat loss phase. So the things we want to look at here is if we think about, I'll use myself as the example again. When I was in the gaining phase, my intake was around like 2,700. Even at maintenance, I was around 2,300. Deficit is 1,600. By default, you just have less calories up your sleeve to play with for different meals. This is one of them. Usually the pre-workout meal is one of them. I said in those episodes a few weeks ago that my pre-workout meal in the gaining phase was like 90 grams of Cocoa Pops and a big serve of milk, and all up it's about like 500 to 600 calories. If I think about being on 1,600 calories, It's just not smart to spend 600 of them on Cocoa Pops. Like, it actually just doesn't make sense. And especially if we think about wanting to hit things like protein, fiber, fruit, veg, fat, whole grains, calcium, all of the things that we want to include in our diet each day for optimal health, by default, we tick all those boxes, we include all those things. There's just not that many calories left. So we just want to understand that this is common and expected and it makes sense. But then at the same time, the thing that I would look at here, two things come to mind here. The first one, and I feel like I would have said this in recent weeks for sure, but this is why I personally love to keep a fat loss phase short, sharp, direct, effective, get in, get the result, get out. I've said that exact sentence a million times. That just flies out my mouth because that is so obvious to me. And this is one of the main reasons why. If we think about this, if a person is asking about like factoring in pre-workout nutrition and optimizing pre-workout nutrition and stuff, to me it says like nutrition and training is a bit of a priority to you, right? If we think about what I just said, where when we're in the deficit, we actually just can't optimize the pre-workout meal. Like something has to give, right? And often it's this. If we then do the maths on all that, in my opinion, I just think, okay, well then I would want to spend as little amount of time in the deficit as possible. Because if you think about a person who prioritizes nutrition and training, usually then they prioritize strength, muscle mass, shape, tone, being lean, being in shape, all of the things that we talk about, performance goals. If we do the maths on that, those things, if we've got a way smaller pre-training meal coming in, obviously that's less energy coming in before we hit the gym. If there's less energy coming in before we hit the gym, we're not going to perform as well as we would if there was more energy coming in. If we're not performing as well, we're not going to optimize strength, muscle mass, shape, tone, performance, all the things I just said. So if you really do the maths on that and think, okay, well, those things are a priority to me. When I'm in a deficit, I can't optimize them. By default, I will spend as little amount of time in a deficit as possible. So really, really have a think about that. And this is why I'm such a fan of, like, not even such a fan, I guess I am such a fan, but like I'm such an advocate of not fucking around in the deficit when you love nutrition and training. Because if you go into a deficit and you plan your days and then you're like, yeah, pre-training had to take a bit of a hit and it's hard to hit my protein and fiber maybe takes a bit of a hit and we just can't optimally hit all the things we want to be hitting. If you're going into a deficit, finding yourself in that position, but then being like, oh, I had a little bit of a snack, had some shit out of the jar, didn't feel like sticking to it on the weekend or whatever. This is the worst position to get into. I'm so far away from the question right now, guys, but I'm just going to roll with it. This is the worst position to get into because you're not optimizing anything, but then it's random shit that's fucking up your progress towards fat loss. So therefore you're not optimizing that. So then you find yourself in a position where you're like, okay, well, pre-training and protein and fiber and all of that is not in the most optimal position it could be in because I'm planning low-cal days. But then I'm straying from that low-cal plan with random shit. So I'm not even making the most of the low-cal days and getting the fat loss progress. If that's the case, get the fuck out of the deficit, pull those random calories over to protein, fiber, pre-training, all the things, and optimize that. So off topic, but I feel like I always end up having that conversation. But that's just where my mind goes because it's so common for people to struggle with all of the things that would be so beneficial to be including, but then be including random shit and then kind of spinning their wheels and, like I said, not optimizing anything. That's so frustrating to me. And then you say to people like, get out of the deficit, go back to maintenance and bring in a big pre-training meal. And people are like, oh, no, because I want to achieve fat loss. But then over here, the random fucking peanut butter you're eating out of the jar is sabotaging that as well. You'd be better pulling those peanut butter calories to pre-training and killing it in the gym. Random side note, she's super off topic. I'm going to bring it back. But that's why I would be, if nutrition and training and pre-training and all of those things are important to you, this is where I'd be like, okay, very short time frame for my fat loss phase. Lock it in. Know that pre-training is going to take a little bit of a hit and won't be able to be as big and as optimal during that time. But my goal at that time is fat loss, dropping excess body fat, getting lean, shredded, whatever my goal is there. As soon as I've optimized that and tick that off, I'm going to pull myself back to maintenance calories. As soon as I go back to maintenance calories, I will make sure pre-training is optimal again, and I will spend most of my time there. And I feel like I'm just describing myself because that is what I love to do. That's such a no-brainer to me. You guys have heard me talk about that here on Instagram, on YouTube, all the places, because that just makes so much sense to me when you want to optimize training for body composition, but also for strength and performance as well. So I'm going to actually answer the question now, 17 minutes later. Best way to factor in pre-workout meal in a deficit. That's the first thing I would say, is just know that it's probably not going to be as optimal if calories are low and it's hard to fit everything in. What I would look at alongside that is, are you wasting calories somewhere else that could be pulled towards pre-training? And there's no right or wrong with this, but that's what I'd be looking at if that's a priority to you and you feel like it's not really getting prioritized right now. And what I mean is, if we think about planning our day and then going into the gym with a pre-training meal where you're like, oh, it's not that big, I don't have much energy, I'm feeling a little bit like weak and lethargic and whatever, because pre-training is not that big, but then I've got a Maxi Bond for dessert. Right? And no shade at all on the Maxi Bond, huge fan of the Maxi Bond, but this is what we need to look at when we're in a deficit. And especially if you're someone who's quite petite or like the calories are quite low when you're in a deficit. If I think again about myself on 1600 calories, there's not a lot to play with. If I was to be having a Maxi Bond for like 300 to 400 calories for dessert, to me, that's like those calories could be utilized somewhere else. So like in such a more beneficial way, if we think about that. So I would just be looking at your day and saying like, are you spending calories in the best way possible for your current phase and your current goal? And even if we tie that into everything I said before, this is why, in my opinion, spend as little amount of time as you can there, because once you go back to your maintenance calories, you can bring in your Maxi Bond. And massive shout out to one of my OG girls, Trina, because she'll be listening for sure. She'll love the shout out. She's quite tiny. She's quite petite, and she's in the Eat Like Ruby muscle gain phase. And she's like, I'm finally having the Maxi Bond. I'm finally having dessert. I'm finally got enough calories up my sleeve to do so. But this is a perfect example. Like I said, she's quite tiny. Calories have always been quite low. It just hasn't made a lot of sense for her to spend 400 calories on a Maxi Bond every night. Now she's getting after the gains. She's got the excess calories. She can do it. It's really cool. But I would be looking at that if you're wanting to have a really tight, strict, really successful fat loss phase. I'm all for flexible dieting, all foods in moderation. Like we all know, I'm the biggest fan of this. I eat Nutella every single day. My dog's name's Nutella. Like I can't stress enough how much I am an advocate of all foods, guys. But this is where you just have to look and say, okay, if my calories are low, if I'm pushing that last little bit of fat loss, if everything has to be really refined and tightened up and optimized, do I need to look at the little extras that are somewhat a waste of calories with my current goal and phase? And the dessert is a perfect example. Another one is like random sort of morning tea or afternoon tea snacks where, you see people have things like, like tiny teddies or barbecue shapes or something as like a snack. And again, no shade on those actual foods, but if you're having 100 or 200 calories on that, like could you have an apple? It'd probably fill you up so much more. It'd probably leave you with another 100 calories. You pull those 100 calories towards pre-training, and then suddenly fruit and fiber intake is up from the apple, extra 100 calories towards pre-training, so training performance is better. It's just about spending them in the most smart way possible for the current goal. So I'm coming back to the question again because I know I'm off topic. Yeah, so I would just be looking at, is there anywhere where I'm kind of wasting calories right now and I could pull them towards that? And then the person said also best low calorie options. This is like kind of a random question, and I'm going to sort of answer it in the way that I want to. Like I said, obviously when we don't have many calories to play with, pre-training is probably going to be a little bit lower calorie, but I wouldn't be looking at pre-training meal and being like, what's my best low cal option here? If I forget fat loss for a second, in my opinion, we want as much food in the system when we go into a training session as possible. I've said this before. I've said it especially on the episodes with Shaq and when we spoke about training the gut and everything. And even such a random perfect example, Shaq today has gone for a 75-kilometer bike ride into a 45-minute run. But he was at home before I left and he was getting ready for that. I was getting ready for this. And he was like, I've had 3 bagels. Like he's always done 2 bagels. He's like, I've had 3 bagels and I'm going to bring in like a bar, like a carby kind of bar when I'm on the bike. And that's just a really cool example because he was like to me, do you think it's too much? And I was like, no, like we've spoke about this before and we spoke about it on the podcast. To me, there actually isn't such a thing as, quote, too much in the pre-training meal until we hit a point where it's like, I feel uncomfortable, like this is my limit, etc. And if we think about Shaq obviously being on a really extreme version of that, doing the half Ironman, most of us don't need 3 bagels and a carb bar before training. I wish. But like, that's just a really perfect example. Like I said to him, really, if we think about training and for him going into a session today that he's never done before, and if we bring it back to like a typical kind of gym girl training, we're always wanting to hit PBs and hit lifts and reps and all the things that we haven't done before. So it's the same kind of thing where you're essentially asking your body to hit a new level. In my opinion, it's like give it as much energy as you possibly can. And what that's going to look like at times is going to be different because if we think about that line of give the body as much energy as it possibly can, what you can possibly give it to work with your deficit calories is going to be different to what you could possibly give it when you're in a gaining phase. So they're going to look different at different times. And then obviously when we think about Shaq doing it on an extreme level, his is going to look different. So I'm not bringing this in to confuse everybody, but what I'm saying is I wouldn't look at a pre-training meal ever in the mindset of like best low calorie option. I would flip that to what is like the most amount of calories I could get in to work with everything else, my goal, my phase, my nutrition targets, my day, everything. What is the most calories I can get in? How many calories can I ideally factor towards this? And then how do I find a food and a meal or whatever that works with that? So I am going to answer your question, I promise, but just that wording of like the best low calorie option for pre-training, I wouldn't be thinking in that way. If we then, like I said, actually answer the question, a cool little thing that I wanted to point out here, and this is something that I do with the fat loss phase meal plans. When I write fat loss phase meal plans, I write them around the 1400 calorie mark as the base, and then I put like add-ons depending on what people's calories are, right? But if you think about it, sort of like the lowest intake I tend to see females on achieving fat loss is 1400 calories. For some people, that's not nutrition advice, that's just an example. But if I'm writing these, obviously, like I said before, when you're on low calories, you're trying to factor in protein, fiber, fat, fruit, veggies, whole grains, calcium, all the things. I do this with all these meal plans. Like I'm sitting there thinking, how do I make this 1400 calories while still fitting in all these things? So one thing I love to look at is how can we tick multiple boxes with a food and a meal? And something I love to do with these meal plans and with a fat loss phase is look at the pre-training meal and say, can this tick another box of either like calcium, whole grains, fruit are really good examples. If we think about a pre-training banana, we want to have carbs in the system when we train, and then we want to eat or like hit our recommended daily fruit intake. So if we could have fruit pre-training, we've just ticked 2 boxes. Same thing with like, another thing I love to do is like whole grain rice cakes or rice crackers. And if we go like whole grain rice cakes and then we do like jam or honey or something on top of them, again, we can get like 30-ish grams of carbs, around like 100 and something calories, like low 100 calories, 30 grams of simple carbs, which is exactly what we want in the system, but we've also ticked a whole grain box. So I love to think about that. And this is something that I love teaching in the fat loss phase is this is why I love example meal plans. I've said that all along. I'm such a fan of example meal plans because I want to show people, yes, you can include all foods in moderation, but also there's a smart way to tick boxes, include all the foods that we know we optimally should for health and in the amounts that are going to suit us and our goal, and then in a flexible, fun way that they're actually tasty and enjoyable. And that's like not an easy thing. And that's why I love example meal plans, because I want to show people how to do that, because that's a lot for someone to get their head around. But coming back to the question, that's where I would be looking and thinking, okay, if I am on low calories, but I do still want to get simple carbs in the system before I train, what are some things I can do? And again, join the fat loss phase and you'll get the pre-training meal module with all these in there. But I love to look at those and say, okay, can they tick multiple boxes? So I'm getting the simple carbs, but I'm also ticking another box for an essential food that I should and want to include every day to work towards good health. I think that's enough on that one. She went hard on that one, guys. So, guys, I have kind of two more questions, but I'm going to answer them as one. The first one was, this kind of came through in a few different ways, but it was basically around how do I and or should I go into a deficit if I also have something like a big holiday or a trip or something coming up during that time that's I'm probably not going to be able to stick to it as strictly or as consistently as I would want to. So that was kind of asked a few times. And then a few people asked as well about best ways to manage a deficit during time of the month. So even though these questions sound really different, I've kind of got a similar answer to both. So I'm going to tackle them together. So the first thing I want to say is with the question about having a trip or having something big, this is so common. This is so common at the moment in Eat Like Ruby. So many people seem to have a holiday planned for end of October, start of November. That just seems to be the time for holidays at the moment. And so a lot of people have kind of been oh, should I do the fat loss phase because it's September, October and into early November? Am I going to be able to do it? Will it be worth it? Kind of energy. The two things I'll say here is, obviously, in my opinion, I wouldn't start a fat loss phase this week and then go on a 4-week holiday next week. If you're literally 4 of the next 5 weeks, I can't stick to this, I would look at that and go, yeah, okay, probably just wait till you get home, right? If we think about that other scenario I just said where someone's oh, my holiday is in week 8 or 9, I would absolutely not fuck around and waste 8 weeks and not pursue your goal for 8 weeks because you have something happening in week 9. That, to me, that blows my mind. And to me, honestly, I think that's a bit of an excuse. If someone's oh, I can't do this 10-week program because I'm on holiday for 2 of those 10 weeks, I think you're trying to find an excuse to not have to get after it. And that's up to you. But I think really just have a think about that. If it's taking up the bulk of your phase, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense. If it's actually a quarter or less of that and it's happening towards the end, I would not delay the shit that you want to achieve just because you're oh, technically I can't stick to it for, if we think about that, someone going on a 10-day holiday in a 10-week fat loss phase, okay, you can't nail 10 of those days. You can nail 60 of them. Don't write off 60 days because of 10. Enough said on that, right? So that's the first thing I'll say there. But if you are in this position and you're thinking, yep, I'm setting up my fat loss phase, maybe I'm joining the Eat Like Ruby fat loss phase, whatever you're doing, and I've got something coming in 2 or 3 months' time, I am the biggest fan, and I teach this so much to the girls in Eat Like Ruby, and I would say this is one of the most beneficial things that my girls learn for long-term success with nutrition and training is understanding enough about nutrition, understanding enough about your own nutrition, and having the option to increase your targets and or go to maintenance, have a diet break, etc. anytime you want to or need to. And this is where it ties into the question about time of the month. With the time of the month, I'm just going to bounce back and forth between these two questions, guys, so just stay with me. With the time of the month question, the sort of common theme with that was people saying if it's hard to stick to the deficit, if there's cravings, if energy's low, if hunger's high, whatever. The first thing I want to say about this, guys, is this is so different for everyone. I've had people in Eat Like Ruby over the years that are just I don't even really notice the difference in any of those things during different times of the month. And then you have people that are I'm fucking starving. My energy's so low. My hunger's so high. My cravings are so high. It's a very obvious thing. So I never want to approach that as a one size fits all or we should all handle it this way or we should all tackle it this way because it's such a different thing. And even if you think about, the intensity of people's symptoms and times of their cycle and all of that, there's so many individual factors. We can't just say this is the way that you should navigate it because it's going to be so different from person to person. But if you're someone who knows that every month this is something that really comes up for you where it's fuck, I'm killing it. And then this happens every month and I'm questioning things, I'm struggling. It's just a very obvious hurdle on a consistent basis. Come back to what I was just saying before. If you've got that option of knowing what your maintenance intake is, how to implement that, how to implement a diet break, etc., This is an absolute game changer for physical results, but also for like mental, emotional, mindset results as well. Because if we think about this, and I actually said this to someone in the current fat loss phase the other day, if you think about being in a position, I'll use myself as an example, like always, my deficit is 1600 calories. If I just knew that there was like 4 or 5 days every month where I'm starving, energy, cravings, all those things I just said really kick in, and I'm just like, fuck, it is so hard for me to stick to 1600 calories. If I know my maintenance is around 2200, right? If I make the conscious, intentional decision to go to that maintenance intake for 4 to 5 days, if you think about that, a person going from 1600 calories to 2200 calories, you've got an extra 600 calories up your sleeve every day, right? And side note, you don't even have to go that far. You might go to like 1900 or 2000, right? But it's a conscious, intentional, controlled decision. And you say, I'm going to go onto this higher intake. I'm going to sit here for 4 or 5 days. I'm still going to tick the boxes of protein, fruit, veg, fiber, veggies, whole grains, calcium, all the things we talk about. But if you're able to do that on 1600 calories, which you have been for the last 3 weeks, when you go to 2200, I would still eat the exact same foods and meals you've been doing on 1600 calories and ticking all those boxes. And then you're like, I've got 600 calories up my sleeve. I could have fucking 600 calories worth of Tim Tams. I could have a 600 calorie bowl of ice cream every night. I could have a 300 calorie chocolate bar for afternoon tea and a maxi bond for dessert. Right? I'm not even kidding, guys. And this is where I think I'm a lot different to a lot of other nutritionists and coaches and whatever. If people say, right, how many coaches would be like, have a cup of herbal tea? Fuck off. Actually, fuck off. If I am like balls deep in hunger, low energy and cravings because of time of the month, a cup of fucking chamomile tea is not fixing this. I don't care what you say. If we think about actually having those additional calories to implement the thing that you're craving, but in a way that's like I said, it's controlled, it's intentional, and it's conscious. Mentally and emotionally, the difference with this is so different to a person that's like, oh, I was trying to stick to my low calories, went into fuck it mode, gave in, had the chocolate bar, the ice cream, the Tim Tams, the Maxi Bon, all of that, had regret and guilt and everything with it because I didn't want to. I was trying to stick to my deficit, but I couldn't. So it's very much done in this energy of like, I didn't want to do it, but I did it. And that's where we tend to see guilt, negativity, I've fucked up. And then the whole like I've fucked up can lead to, spiraling into a week of fucking up, falling off track forever. Like there's so many directions that can go. Even if it doesn't go in those directions, it still leaves people in that position of feeling like a failure. I've spoken about this before with like festive season dieting and Christmas dieting and all of that. If you are doing something that's so hard for you to stick to over and over and over, so much so that you give in and fall off track, there's a big element there that's like, I'm a failure. I've just failed because I didn't want to handle it the way that I ended up handling it. If we can see that and make a conscious decision before it happens and intercept it and go, you know what, every month, this is so fucking hard for me. I'm going to spend 400 or 500 days on a higher intake. Like I said, still tick the boxes, good health, all the things, but factor in those things that I'm craving. Have them in the afternoon, have them for dessert or whatever. So I'm looking forward to them. I know they're coming. They feel great. Like I'm loving life. I've ticked off my cravings, like killed my hunger, energy, all those things that I was feeling, I'm no longer feeling. But it's done in a like conscious way. You're like, I said I was going to do this and I did it. That shit is so it's such a game changer compared to a person, like I said, that didn't want to do it and does it. So that's the first thing. But if we think like, I love how I say first thing when I'm like literally so puffed and out of breath for talking. But the other thing there is, if we think about trying to stick to the low calories and then, like I said, eventually giving in because it is really hard and everything kind of accumulates and we fall off track, usually then it's just like, okay, well, I'll have half a packet of Tim Tams or maybe a whole packet and I'll have 2 bowls of ice cream and all these things. And then the intake might end up being 3,500 calories. Like I said before, the mindset and the mental and emotional that comes with that is really shitty. But also the physical result then is like, well, you've consumed 2,000 calories more than you were planning on doing. In the other scenario, when we've made the conscious choice to go to maintenance, we've consumed an extra 600 calories, but we know that it's our maintenance intake. We know that it was a conscious choice. We're not left feeling like regretful about it because it was part of the plan. And like I said, the actual physical part of that is like, I'm sitting at maintenance, not I've just fucking blown out to 4,000 calories. Big physical difference there as well. And if we bring that back to the actual results, if you think about a person, let's look at a 3-month window where a person nails a deficit, let's say 20 to 25 days of a month, and then they spend 2 to 5 days at maintenance, depending on how long this shit hits them for, right? If you then look at a 3-month window where you've spent, let's say, 70 to 75 days in your deficit, and you've spent 10 to 15 of those days eating at maintenance. That is a fantastic 3 months compared to a person, if we think about the alternative, a person that tries to diet for 3 months, maybe they do, successfully diets for 3 months, falls off track for a week every month, blows out, has a lot of mental and emotional guilt, regret, negativity around that, but also physically consumes a very big amount of calories that they weren't planning on consuming, then goes back into the deficit for 3 weeks, does it again for the 4th week, back to the deficit for 3, does it again for the 4th. You look back over those 3 months, mentally, emotionally, you're like, I'm fucking falling off track every month. Physically, you're probably taking 2 steps forward and 2 steps back, and therefore just being like, I'm actually not getting anywhere. If we think about going to maintenance, the way I love to look at going to maintenance, guys, is if we think about a person falling off track often, like I said, it's very much a cycle of 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. If you think about a person intentionally factoring in time at maintenance for time of the month, for holidays, for a diet break, for, like I even said way back at the start of the episode, if you've got you're moving house, so you've got a big exam block, you've got something happening in your life and you just implement a diet break. If we think about that, an intentional time at maintenance, if we think about maintenance is standing still, right? If you diet for 3 weeks, 2 steps forward, stand still for 1 week, you go back to your deficit for 3 weeks, another 2 steps forward, stand still for 1 week, back to the deficit, another 2 steps forward. Again, we look back over 3 months, you've taken 6 steps forward. If you don't want to implement the diet break or the time at maintenance or anything because you're like, no, I want to keep my deficit going the whole time, but doing so is so hard because of the cravings, hunger, all of that shit that can come with the time of the month, or because you've got something like a holiday or a really stressful period in your life, and therefore you try and stick to low calories, but you can't, and you go 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, and then the next month you go 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, and then the next month you go 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, you look back over that 3 months and you have not moved at all. Think about the difference there. In the first scenario, we took 6 steps forward. Even though we stood still for a week every month, over the whole 3 months, we took 6 steps forward. In the other scenario, we did not move at all because every time we took 2 steps forward, we then took 2 steps back because we weren't willing to work with other things in our life, implement the diet break, go to maintenance, be open to navigating it a different way and actually working with it. This is, if you can't tell, I haven't taken a breath for the last 15 minutes because this shit is I'm so passionate about this stuff because when I see people cultivate this skill, first of all, understand it, become aware of it, understand it, accept it, and then start to work on it and cultivate these skills, it is life-changing to be in a position where you're like, okay, I can see something coming that's going to be quite tricky for me to stick to low calories. Instead of just forcing myself to try and do so, instead of just, quote, trying to be good, I can actually take everything I've learned about nutrition, everything I know about myself, my way of handling things, my habits, my preferences, my lifestyle, all of these things, and pivot on those plans a little bit to actually work with my life. That is a fucking game changer. I can't say it enough. I can't stress it enough. So if I come back to the questions of I've got a big trip or something coming up, should I implement a deficit? How would you do so, etc.? And then a person saying time of the month. How do we navigate that with the deficit? My advice there, if we haven't picked up what I'm putting down, is get the knowledge, skill, and ability to factor in time at maintenance, diet breaks, higher calorie days, anything like that. This can be navigated in so many different ways, but actually being aware of that, understanding that, and having the skills to do so is my number one piece of advice. And this is, if we think about what I said before, sometimes people will have a 1 week or a 2 week thing, and then they use it as a reason to not do something for 10 weeks. If you think about that if you're waiting for this perfect 10-week or 12-week window where you can implement a really strict diet, you're hardly ever going to get that in your life. If you think about a 3-month phase of your life, usually something is going to come up that's going to make it a little bit tricky to stick to a diet. If you're waiting for the time that that's not going to happen, you're going to be waiting forever. And how convenient you never have to fucking do the thing. That's a whole nother topic. But this is where we want to look. And this is why I'm so passionate. You guys have probably heard me say, like, we're going to be eating for the rest of our lives. When I run something like the fat loss phase, I teach the maintenance, the diet breaks, the enjoying meals out, calorie cycling, going as hard as we want to, pulling back if we want to, all of these things, because I never want people to come into something like the fat loss phase or anything that you join where you're like, I need to just knuckle down and be good for these 10 weeks. Because then what does happen when period cravings kick in? What does happen when you go on a holiday? What happens when you move house? You've got a stressful thing happening in your life. You do night shift. You've got exams. You've got any of these things that pop up. Like, this shit is going to happen in your life. If you are only able to diet on the good days, what are you going to do on the bad days for the rest of your life? I feel like this is the perfect place for me to wrap up. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep going and going. Those were my last few questions. So I hope that was beneficial. I feel like I did answer all the questions, but I also went in a few tangents, but I feel like that's why you're all here. We all love it. Like I said, guys, we have something really cool happening next week with the podcast, so stay tuned for that. We have the final Eat Like Ruby Fat Loss phase starting at the start of September. So if you are keen to implement fat loss, if you are keen to learn everything I just spoke about and you want to get after it for the back half of 2024, this is the time to do so. Guys, come whatever the Monday is, I'm looking at my calendar right now. Monday, September 9th, Eat Like Ruby is closed for 2024. Like, you cannot join anything in Eat Like Ruby for the remainder of 2024. So if you are sitting there thinking fat loss training, whatever it is, whatever your goal is, you've got probably like 3 to 4 more weeks. September 9th, she's shutting down. We actually have some really cool shit happening towards the end of the year and into 2025. I'm not going to talk about that yet, but just know we are closing for, I'd say it's a couple of months while we get all those things sorted. And yeah, I'm sure people are going to reach out and be like, oh my God, I should have joined. So if you think you're going to be a I should have joined person, just join. But apart from that, guys, I will be back next week with my juicy week. You guys will see what I'm talking about when that happens. And then we'll be back over the next few weeks. We're also on YouTube every single week at the moment, guys, documenting my own personal fat loss phase. So if you want to see what that looks like in terms of shopping, like grocery shopping, day on a plate, training, all those things, definitely check that out. If you're not following Instagram, it's eat_like_Ruby. But that is all from me today. Thanks, guys.